Good day, everyone. This is Dr. Smith. We're into the last of our Module 19 video lectures, which comprise metals, pesticides, organic chemicals, radiation, and now food safety. An extremely important topic, and we see results of or examples of how food safety can impact public health as well as the environmental health causes of food safety virtually every day in the public literature as well as the scientific literature. And so we'll talk about this with respect to what are some of the measures to prevent foodborne illness at the end, some of the microbial agents and other agents as well that are implicated in foodborne illness, what foodborne illness means, and the significance of this for the world's population, not only from an illness standpoint, but very briefly from a cost standpoint. And 5 other categories of contaminants in the food supply. We'll also look at some of the at least major U.S. regulations for protecting the safety of food from carcinogens and just ensuring food safety in general. And so let's begin. We talk about food safety from the standpoint of foodborne diseases and infections, and this is defined very briefly as illnesses acquired by consumption of contaminated food. Very frequently and accurately referred to as food poisoning. That's the general catch-all category of I ate somewhere last night and I feel horrible today. We'll refine that a little bit more for you so you have a better knowledge of that. This is a really important part of environmental health, globally, locally, and everywhere in between. It's also a very important part of public health, as these outbreaks and things that we'll talk about in a moment can significantly impact large populations. And so we bring up all of the skills that we're leveraging, not only environmental health, but epidemiology, biostatistics, policy, regulation, and also behavioral instances that can lead to foodborne outbreaks, foodborne disease, and the perpetuation of that. So a foodborne outbreak is the occurrence of a similar illness among 2 or more people. That's interesting. It's a very low number, which an investigation linked to consumption of a common meal or food items, except for botulism. We'll talk about botulism in more detail later, where 1 case is considered an outbreak. Again, this is in the United States. But the global burden of foodborne illness, this is a major cause of morbidity and occasionally mortality, both in the United States and other countries of the world. Now, there's a great argument around the fact that in developed countries such as the U.S. and other places, foodborne illness tends to be more prevalent as far as morbidity is concerned, because we also tend to have cleaner water, better control of food, and so when an outbreak actually occurs, we're not as resistant to that. The use of antibiotics and things like that can also be a factor. But as we become a more global community, as we become more like real, citizens of the world, then we're going to have a lot more incidents of these. And truthfully, that leads to the second point, which is in industrialized nations, we have seen over the past 30 to 40 years an increase in the incidence of foodborne illness. There are a number of factors around that. Why do we see that? We see that because agriculture and food processing methods have changed. And so we have large-scale agriculture versus small home and farm agriculture. We have food processing on large scales that can introduce or be a place for the introduction of foodborne illness. We see globalization of food distribution. And so food that's grown, produced, and potentially contaminated in one part of the world can easily and readily reach another part of the world. And we see that from time to time recently in Riverside here with some sushi from fish that was imported from Japan. We also see social and behavioral changes in the human population. And so the social changes can be related to cultural changes as well, in that we have much more mixed cultures around the world, especially in industrialized nations, and also behavioral changes. Some become more averse to germs and the presence of contaminated food or potentially contaminated food. And so, yeah, there are a lot of factors that contribute to the increase in foodborne illness, but I think, truthfully, the top two, the changes in agriculture, broad scale, and food processing method. Anytime you process something, and we'll see that towards the end of the presentation, you introduce places where contamination can occur. And anytime you have large-scale distribution, then you potentially impact more people than you would if it was very local. And so we see that global increase. In the U.S. alone, this can affect about a quarter of the population. It causes roughly 9,000 deaths, and this is averaged over a period of time, and incurs an economic cost of $5 billion. And so this is both cost of treating a foodborne outbreak or investigating a foodborne outbreak. This is the cost to individual businesses, a potential lost business. This is the lost time incurred when people are out sick from work and other things due to foodborne illness. This is the cost of addressing food outbreaks, food poisoning, food contamination outbreaks at the level of the CDC and other surveillance networks at the state level and local level. And this goes worldwide. So the costs are enormous here, but again, think back to the factors of global distribution, large-scale agricultural production, and so it makes it easier for things to happen on a broader scale than when we had more local economies, local food production, and local food distribution. Again, the resistance factor is something that I think is a huge thing, whereby we're just more susceptible to some of these things. Surveillance in the U.S., the CDC maintains responsibility at the federal level. They have an active network that goes to public health officials, then to the regional, the county, the city, et cetera level. And so these are all associated with surveillance, both identifying exposures, reporting exposures if people actually report those. Here's something I would encourage you to do. If you, for example, go and buy food or eat at a restaurant and you actually experience some distress after that, don't hesitate to report that to the county health department you live in or even the city. Because without the reporting, if you see the bottom levels of this pyramid, exposures in the population, people become ill. Not a lot of people, or most people, actually go to the level of seeking care and getting a specimen and having that sent in and get reported. It's only when something becomes rapidly widespread that we do that. And so to support the distribution network, or the surveillance network, I think it's really important for us to not be just super reactive, but also to report those things where you say, wow, I ate here and I got really sick. I'm just going to call them and let them know. So that'll support our public health system in a large way if each of us takes a little more responsibility and also promotes a little more awareness of how this actually works from a reporting standpoint. When we talk about food hazards, there are really four major categories. The biological, which tends to be the most significant, at least in developed nations and in the U.S. These are the pathogens. We also have physical things where, stones, glass, metals, you get contaminations, and there's actual physical hazards that can be associated. I think this is a relatively small portion. Chemical hazards from contamination, either intentionally or accidentally. And then nutritional hazards where you have maybe over addition of nutrients or deficient amounts that can lead to disease. Now, this doesn't necessarily happen as much in, well, I hypothesize there. This can happen in situations, but likely or not, the deficiency is in a situation where you have more local economy or locally grown food that, for one reason or another, is just not creating the nutritional standard we need to see. And so to go through these categories, we talk biology first, or biological agents. The bacterial agents are the things that I think we're most familiar with and probably need to deal with the most, except in rare cases, in a public health and environmental health standpoint. Salmonella, Clostridium botulinum, otherwise known as botulism, Staph aureus, Clostridium, norovirus, and some other things we'll talk about in a little more detail. They're bacteria. They're one-celled organisms that have, rod shapes or curved, and there are many diagnostics for these, visual as well as chemical. But these form the biggest group of things that we typically think about and see in public health as far as food-borne agents of disease. Well, Salmonella, salmonellosis, these are rod-shaped, very mobile, gram-negative, non-spore-forming, and the most common types in the U.S. are the enterotitis and the typhimurium. Salmonella is actually ranked as or among the most frequent types of foodborne illness in the U.S. This can come from a variety of cases or a variety of sources. 2 to 4 million reported cases, and within that, the non-reported are a significant part. So it's kind of anecdotal, estimated each year. This can cause about 500 deaths each year. Again, remember, most of those deaths will occur in sensitive subpopulations that we talk about with respect to any other health effect, which are infants and children, elderly, immunocompromised, or other kinds of chronic disease that tend to lower our resistance to any kind of insult, be it chemical, radioactive, toxicological, or food-borne illness. And some of the sources here, Salmonella, it's widespread. It's almost everywhere. Wild animals, domestic animals are big reservoirs for that. Animals that are used for human consumption may have it, so we see Salmonella cases in processed beef, pork, poultry. Animals can also carry this and be reservoirs for Salmonella. So it's not necessarily just the food we eat, but it's also our pets. But that can be, if we're not careful, we can take that from the pets into our food in the home or in other settings and introduce that into the food stream. And some animals and birds are chronic carriers of that. So you'll see that out in the widespread environment more. How are they transferred? Environmental surfaces at work and home, in the kitchen, from the pets, as we just mentioned. Raw meats, poultry, and seafood can already be contaminated. And so if you're not careful about cleaning the surfaces at home, this goes for any kind of bacterial contamination or contaminations in general. But Salmonella is present, as we mentioned, in the animals, so the feces, or even the, in your any other contact with the animals can potentially have Salmonella. It can be transferred if you're not very clean and hygienic, especially in the food preparation areas. Contaminated water and soil can also bear this, and we see this from time to time in agricultural settings where the Salmonella was present, for example, potentially at high concentrations in the soil, and during harvesting and processing it was not cleaned adequately, and hence then transmitted disease over the period. When we talk about Salmonella, these are very interesting because these are kind of generalized symptoms. 6 to 48 hours, and I've heard other estimates that say 4 to 8 hours, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a very short term and then you're out of the window. It depends on the type of exposure and the magnitude of exposure. Nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, fever, headache. If you have this chronically, you can include more arthritic-like symptoms, so joint aches and body aches 3 to 4 weeks after this acute onset. Sounds very much like the flu, doesn't it? And so a lot of times, especially during the, quote, flu seasons of the year, people who may have Salmonella exposure and symptomology are not reporting because, I just have the flu. So it's hard to tell without some more extensive lab tests. But again, if you think there's an association between typically some food you ate or contact with one of the vectors we talked about in the previous slide, then it's good to report that nonetheless to the local and county health department. Clostridium botulinum, this is pretty serious. Salmonella can be serious, and there are deaths from Salmonella. Again, primarily in the sensitive subpopulations we see in the U.S. But Clostridium botulinum causes botulism. This is an anaerobic bacteria, produces a very, very, very potent toxin, a neurotoxin. We see a lot of this in home canning that's done improperly. or it can occur in commercial canning or preservation of food if the proper sanitary steps are not taken. You see onset within 18 to 36 hours, but it can be longer than that. This is a little bit different than, or quite a bit different than what we see with Salmonella, in that you see lassitude, which is just kind of like I have no energy, weakness, vertigo, I'm dizzy, double vision. It starts to affect the glottis and the epiglottis, so speaking and swallowing are impaired. It moves on to impair smooth muscle, involuntary muscle, and so you have difficulty in respiration and breathing, muscle weakness across, you get abdominal distension, and as opposed to Salmonella with diarrhea, you have you'll see constipation. Clostridium perfringens is the most common, about 10,000 cases a year. It commonly is found in fecally contaminated area. It's found in us naturally, but not to the extent that it can cause the symptomology. Again, the symptoms: intense cramping, initially diarrhea, long-term is constipation, onset is variable, duration about 24 hours, and this can be very serious, and so it should be considered to be very serious. And especially with respect to Clostridium botulinum, this is more like a Salmonella kind of effect, whereas the Clostridium botulinum is very dangerous and can lead to mortality very quickly. And so if you are experiencing those symptoms, somebody needs to get care immediately. We hear a lot about Escherichia coli or E. coli. The L157H7 variety is the most pathogenic strain. Outbreaks occur in restaurant chains, outbreaks occur through different foods. It's not just meat, it can be vegetables. There was a huge E. coli outbreak a couple of years ago locally with contaminated lettuce and some other vegetables. And this can actually lead to very serious effects, and there have been deaths based on this. The Wendy's food chain had some E. coli deaths about 5 years ago from contaminated hamburger meat in the Midwest. Children and adults both died from exposure to this. E. coli is pervasive. The pathogenic strain is pervasive as well. It depends a lot on the susceptibility and the concentration of the organism that actually gets into the body. But this is something to be very aware of, and this is one of the things, this and Salmonella we'll hear probably more about in the popular press than we do about botulinum toxins and even the Staph aureus. So E. coli and Salmonella are two things to pay a lot of attention to. But with respect to Staphylococcus, Staph aureus is the primary pathogen. We see humans and animals a reservoir. This is an interesting bacteria because it resides in the nose and skin lesions on the skin, and once you've been exposed to this, most of us have, and from public settings, from clinical settings, from friends or what have you, it can remain resident in the skin or in the nose for extended period, years, frankly, and can all of a sudden elaborate. This is problematic because in both clinical and public settings, not necessarily coming from food, but this is a highly resistant to treatment kind of disease, and we have heard about the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, or MRSA, which is becoming more and more prevalent across the United States in a variety of settings, highly difficult to treat, resistant to most antibiotics in normal doses, and so it's high-dose antibiotics with it can be very problematic. And so if you either have experienced effects from a gastrointestinal or skin lesions that seem to be getting worse, seem to be highly infected, you should immediately contact your healthcare provider and get some treatment for that. But MRSA is becoming a real big problem. The vector from food is that when animal products in particular, animal keepers, and clean practices are not followed, this can be transmitted through food items or even packaging to the general population. Not as prevalent anymore, but still a concern, is trichinosis. This is a foodborne disease with eating meat, primarily pork, that comes from a tiny small worm nematode of the genus Trichinella. Trichinella spiralis can be found in a lot of things that are carnivores and omnivores. And again, we think about pigs and things, but walrus, rodents, cougars, bears, almost anything that eats other meat or that eats both a meat and a omnivorous diet can have this. And so from an exposure pathway in the US and many countries, pork and pork products are the primary transmission pathway. And you see there's a graphic here about the pig or the animal is eating contaminated meat scraps or contaminated other things. That meat has larvae encysted in the muscle or the meat tissue, and that gets actually passed on. Then when a human doesn't cook the meat enough and eats that, it then becomes resident in the small intestine, and the cycle begins once again. And so that human waste can transfer more and more of the trichinosis. Symptomology here can range from gastrointestinal disturbance to actually neurologic effects if it gets bad enough. Because if the population, if it's not treated for the infestation or the infection, they can actually invade the trichinosis worms can actually invade other organs and cause organ failure, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is something to be aware of because it is directly a food-borne kind of disease. Tapeworms, Taeniasis, is a parasitic disease caused by tapeworms, the beef tapeworm, the pork tapeworm. They can induce illness following the consumption of raw or undercooked infected beef or pork or other things. You can also get this from just direct contact if you happen to work around animals. Then this can be transmitted through direct contact if you're not washing hands, and things like that can become infection with the tapeworm. The thing about tapeworm infection is that it's usually pretty mild symptomology unless you have a really, really serious infection, and then what happens is you start to see a weight loss and things like that, but it's hard to know sometimes. One of the main symptomologies is the passage of these little sections of the worm with eggs. They shed these sections that have eggs to trying to perpetuate the life cycle, and it comes out in the stools. And so unless you're inspecting your stools or have other reason to suspect that, it's difficult to detect the tapeworm infection. And many people live for many, many years with tapeworm infection and are completely unaware of that, that they have that, and can pass along the infection to others if there's not proper sanitary conditions. And so, it's not the most common disease. We don't see it typically from a public health standpoint, and it's not a huge public health kind of epidemic thing, but just be aware that it is there, and the primary transmission is through food substances, as mentioned. Moving a little bit out of the bacterial into the viral foodborne illnesses caused by viral agents, hepatitis A. Lots of foods associated with HAV outbreaks, fruit sandwiches, et cetera, et cetera. And this is primarily coming from food handling. So a worker infected with some kind of hepatitis, be it A or C, and the processing plants or the restaurants, this is for the primary transmission. And this is thought to be a minor transmission mode compared to all the cases of hepatitis A, for example, in the US. About 7% are thought to be food or waterborne, so the majority are not through this, but it is a potential pathway for transmission. Hepatitis A, the primary thing is liver infection, although there are other organs affected, with decreasing efficiency of the organ function, and potential death if left untreated by liver failure. Norovirus is one that's become quite prevalent in the surveillance by public health departments and other public health officials. This is very easily transmitted within closed environments such as cruise ships. We've seen that in the past number of years, but it's also very prevalent in home kitchens and restaurant kitchens and food production areas if, again, proper sanitation measures are not followed. Norovirus and E. coli were responsible for the Bluebell ice cream outbreak or catastrophe epidemic in 2015, which killed a number of people and almost bankrupted the company because of just poor sanitation practices that should have been captured. It can be transferred by people through hands, primarily. Cruise ships are a classic environment because they're somewhat closed environments, so exposure can happen and the disease can spread very rapidly. What you have are the vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration due to the vomiting and diarrhea, abdominal cramps that last a couple days, although in serious cases you can have this continue on for up to a week, and that's potentially life-threatening if there's not if treatment isn't sought and rehydration. Norovirus is very widespread in the home also, as mentioned, if the infestation or the infection gets established, and it's very simple sanitary practices about cleaning surfaces, cleaning implements, cleaning cutting boards and things like that. But this can be repeated, and so once the infection is established in the home or in the individual, if there isn't a change to the sanitary practices, this can be repeated over and over again. There are some other things besides bacteria and virus, prions, and this is kind of a special case because a few years ago this was discovered in the mad cow disease, the cause of bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And it wasn't able to be linked to anything from a bacteria or a virus or any known cause. And eventually it was discovered, evaluated, that prions, which are kind of for lack of a better term, a mutated virus, are regarded as the cause of this. And it's progressive, it's ultimately fatal, and it can be transmitted amongst cattle. So there was a big scare in '86. This first was discovered in the United Kingdom, but many countries reported the occurrence of this in cattle. There are cases reported in the U.S. There were bans on importation and exportation of beef products throughout the European Union and between the EU and the U.S. It wasn't established. The EU wasn't established at the time, but in an effort to reduce this occurrence. And so just a brief slide on some of the prions that are related to different diseases. So you'll see in the second one you have the mad cow disease, bovine spongiform. There are other varieties of this in wild game in most continents, and also in humans in the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease syndrome, which is caused by a prion of a slightly different variation than we have with the BSE disease. We also have chemically related foodborne hazards, such as chemical toxins or naturally occurring, not chemical toxins, but naturally occurring toxins, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, veterinary medicines in meat, primarily antibiotics, and additives used for a variety of purposes. So I apologize because I said chemical toxins, and I have a thing about that. A toxin is a naturally occurring substance, toxic substance, such as those from seafood and certain kinds of mushrooms. Toxins are not related to chemicals. It's just a distinction. But and so some of the naturally occurring things we have from marine toxins, ciguatoxin, which comes from certain species of fish, scombroid toxin, which is related to red tide or the algal blooms, the syndrome of paralytic shellfish poisoning, pufferfish toxin. Most of these things are highly neurotoxic. Here's the ciguatoxin, and these are primarily found in tropical reef fish such as wrasse and groupers and things like that. They're not destroyed by cooking, and so these are potentially very deadly and fatal neurotoxins that are persistent even in the environment to an extent. Pufferfish toxin is another example, and you may have heard the stories of very rare sushi taking out pufferfish, the toxic organ, in order to have this special fish. This will kill you in a heartbeat. These are just some examples. There's others too, related to red tide and algal blooms that produce an endotoxin that then accumulates in certain fish that can be eaten by human beings and produce some of these effects: vomiting, neurotoxicity, gastric distress in general. We also are considering things like heavy metals we talked about earlier in foods. This is typically not something that comes from an environmental standpoint, but rather is clearly related to processing, except in the case of, as we discussed earlier, mercury. And so certain species of fish can have levels of mercury that may be high enough and bioconcentratable, bioaccumulative enough that they will produce adverse effects to reproductive effects or developmental effects in humans. Metals, we mentioned this earlier, that leach into foods from metal containers and other cooking vessels. So glazes that are used on things that are cooked with, or containers that have acidic components, can actually leach metals out into the foods. At one point we had certain candy wrappers that were manufactured in Mexico that had lead in the pigment that was used to print the labeling. Chicken contained high levels of arsenic depending on the food supplement, and some of the things that are used to control intestinal parasites. Pesticides in foods. Clearly we apply pesticides, all kinds, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc., to reduce impacts and things, and that may leave residues on the foods. Hence the great movement towards organic food and certified food that does not have any synthetic organic pesticides applied. Some pesticides which are applied to the soil or whatever can be taken up into the crop, and it's difficult, if not impossible, to wash it off because it's internal. Other pesticides are external and can be washed off with simple soap and water. And so just to minimize, you always want to wash vegetables, both for the pesticides that may be external as well as any kind of bacteria and things like that that might be resident. There's a big issue around the use of antibiotics and antimicrobials in cattle and poultry and other livestock that are raised for human consumption. Based on the agricultural practices, high concentrations of animals in small places lead to disease, so they have to use antibiotics to prevent the disease from spreading, and this can have be resident in the meat that is then consumed by human beings. Some of the examples of approved antibiotics that can be given to food animals are amoxicillin, penicillin, bacitracin, and erythromycin, which sound remarkably like the antibiotics that are given to people for disease. So the whole antibiotic resistance issue from consuming antibiotics, not only clinically that are misprescribed, but also from our food sources in the environment, can lead to these resistant strains of microbes. We see that related to the Staph aureus, the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus we talked about earlier, but a lot of other things. And so the residues of these antibiotics can persist in the meat. We will eat the meat, and then that may cause a loss of the ability of antibiotics we need for therapeutic interventions to actually work. So a consideration. Food additives, either intentional or indirect, things that are added to foods to improve the quality, such as things that are added to prevent discoloration or preservatives, versus unintentional things that happen during packaging, storage, handling, or intentional things like malicious things that are introduced into foods, are all things from a food quality standpoint we need to be aware of. Excuse me. And some of the intentional things, preservatives to keep bacteria from growing, yeast and mold, antioxidants in fatty foods to prevent oxidation and rancidity. Some of the things we look at are nitrates, which are used widely in preserved meat and bacon, butylated hydroxyanisole and butylated hydroxytoluene are certain preservatives, disodium ETA. All of these things, which we now know are not necessarily without adverse health effects in human beings. And so, again, a wide movement to avoid either the use of those or the exposing ourselves to those in our food supply. In the United States, the FDA is the U.S. agency charged with regulating and enforcing food safety, but the U.S. Department of Agriculture regulates the safety of meat and poultry products. So we see right here a little bit of a conflict in that for certain things, there's a dichotomy of who's actually enforcing it. It can lead to some issues. Some of the development of food safety in 1906, so it's been noticed for a long time, and I want you to remember back to talking about when we talk about food safety in 1906. So this has been underway in the U.S. for quite some time. The book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, 1906, exposing some really horrific practices, both labor practices and food production practices in the meat industry in Kansas City, kind of led to a lot of things around, or supplemented a lot of things around that first Food and Drug Act. Went through a progression over the years and changes of who was going to administer and who was going to be checking on food quality and the different additives and things that go into our food supply. One of the major things that happened was fairly early on, the Delaney Clause, which was part of the Food Additives Amendment of 1958. This was a blanket clause that prohibited the use of additives, including pesticides, that have been determined to cause cancer in human beings or animals. This was a fantastic development. However, it was virtually impossible to enforce because at that time, there were very few things that had actually been determined to cause cancer in human beings or animals. So it essentially went without enforcement because we didn't have the scientific basis to actually enforce prohibiting the use of things that cause cancer. That was eventually replaced in a later Food Safety Act we'll talk about here in a minute. One of the things that's most interesting is that generally recognized as safe. In the U.S., the GRAS rule permits the use of an additive that had an established history of safe use in foods. And so the list is shortening. However, there are still a number of things that are allowed in food because essentially they were grandfathered in because they've been used safely based on a wide variety of criteria over a number of years, and therefore we're still allowed to be presented or permitted to use in foods as additives. So this in the past 10 years has undergone an enormous amount of scrutiny, and the GRAS list has changed dramatically and will continue to change dramatically, I believe, over the next several years. But just be aware there is actually a generally recognized as safe rule for things that can be put into food. As I mentioned when we were talking about Delaney, the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996 essentially repealed Delaney because it wasn't working and established a standard that a substance could not cause a lifetime incidence of more than one cancer per 1 million exposed people. This is 1 times 10 to the minus 6 excess lifetime cancer risk. Now, by 1996, we had a lot more scientific data and a lot more investigation into those things that could or potentially could cause cancer. So the Food Quality Protection Act put a little more teeth into actually preventing cancer-causing substances from being allowed in the food stream. With respect to regulation, this is a slide that just shows some of the key players. At the top level, you have the World Health Organization, represented by the Food and Agricultural Organization. Now, remember that the WHO does not have any enforcement capacity. So their recommendations can or cannot be accepted by whoever. They simply make recommendations and do investigations. They can leverage things like economic sanctions, country by country, or European Union by European Union, but the World Health Organization is mostly an investigative recommendation type body with no regulatory authority. At the U.S. level, as we already looked at, we have the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, who essentially regulates food safety, but we have the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who inspects meat and produce for safety in the production side of it. So there's a little dichotomy there. The Centers for Disease Control, again, is a non-regulatory federal governmental agency that makes recommendations, does interventions, can leverage resources, but doesn't have any ability to directly change regulations or regulatory or policy statuses. And then we move down in the United States to the state level using California Department of Health Services Food and Drug Branch, and that goes down to typically county level things or city level enforcement of food regulations. So you'll have for the county or city of San Bernardino or Loma Linda restaurant inspectors that will go out and check whether or not the restaurants are performing adequately with respect to food safety. With respect to that, foodborne disease and prevention, these are some very practical factors. I just want to go over very quickly with you so you have an idea of what, for example, food inspectors are doing. Some of the top things are inadequate cooling and cold holding temperatures. So if the refrigerator isn't working well and things start to warm up, then that introduces the potential for food contamination, primarily by bacterial things. Inadequate hot holding temperatures is also a risk. So here's some numbers about keeping foods hot and keeping foods cold that need to be followed through with and what the inspectors regulate. To prevent the growth of pathogens, we see this everywhere. You must wash your hands before returning to work. Trying to prevent cross-contamination. So, for example, in a restaurant or in your home, excuse me, not using a knife that you just trimmed the chicken with to cut up the vegetables. Making sure you cook things at sufficiently high temperatures to kill any kind of pathogens, and then storing food at the proper temperatures as referenced above. Another kind of controversial issue has been irradiation of food, and I'll just give you this slide because there are some, as we talked about in the radiation actually changes molecular structure, and so even though the ionizing radiation quote passes through foods and destroys bacteria, it doesn't cause the food to become radioactive, but does it cause a change to the food that has a potential for an adverse health effect? There's a lot of controversy around this as a way to minimize pathogenic introduction of pathogens into the food supply. And finally, the hazard analysis of critical control points. So this is very much a procedural, operational kind of public health or environmental health aspect of food safety. And this gives essentially kind of a checklist for establishing monitoring of food to ensure the best food safety from harvest, as it says, to consumption. It's been around for a while. It gets updated every once in a while, but it's still followed pretty closely in food inspection routines of performing an overall hazard analysis, critical control points, etc., down to corrective actions and a record-keeping system. So this is much more on the ground, practical kind of food safety inspection system that you need to be aware of. Thank you so much. That ends our food safety lecture. Any questions, please direct them to me or to the discussion board for week 5. Thanks so much.